The Order of the Temple of Solomon had been founded in the aftermath of the First Crusade, a Christian military expedition which had captured Jerusalem from the Muslims. The first Templars had dedicated their lives to God by protecting pilgrims, but the order had soon proved itself to be the most effective military unit in the crusading army. At the Horns of Hattin, the Templar Knights had been singled out by Saladin and almost eliminated from the Holy Land. But in their short 60-year existence, the Templars had constructed an enormous support network throughout Western Europe that provided the front line with men and supplies. In fact, this elite military unit had created for itself the world's first multinational corporation. Since the Order of the Temple had first been established early in the 12th century, it had set out to attract recruits and raise funds. Although an individual knight could own nothing, he still needed horses, weaponry, and servants if he was to carry out God's work effectively. The King of Jerusalem had initially aided the Templars. Among the many reasons for doing so was the knowledge that visiting pilgrims brought much-needed income to the fledgling Crusader states. Pilgrims required food and lodging, they paid road tolls, and they brought gifts. From the very beginning, the Templars were entirely comfortable with the economic realities of serving God in the Holy Land. The Templar Corporation, or network, began in Western Europe, built up from gifts of land donated by men and women who wanted to protect their immortal souls by supporting the Crusaders in the Holy Land. Many of the earliest donations received by the Templars were from men who wanted to join the order themselves. One of the most substantial donors came from Champagne, in northern France.
Hugh, Count of Champagne, joined the order in the 1120s, and he was one of its earliest important patrons. But once he joined the order, he lost the status that came with being an important territorial ruler. He had to abrogate his own will to that of the master, and he had to live the life of an ordinary knight. So one gave up a considerable amount in terms of status and in material comfort in order to become a Templar. But if you sincerely believe that what really matters is your immortal soul and not your short and transitory life on earth, then it would be seen as worth it.
The Templars gratefully accepted many such gifts of land, which were channeled into productive communities where the brothers in the West lived and worked. It was these communities, called preceptories, that became the bedrock of the Templar network.
I think that the Templars gave a good deal of thought to the best way of exploiting their Western preceptories for the purposes of supporting their military front line. But it's not entirely easy to do this consistently, since by their very nature donations tend to be random. As time went on, they tried quite hard to rationalise their holdings in a way which would make them more effective, and even in some areas to provide preceptories which were rather specialist, perhaps specialist in banking or in stud farms or in providing shipping and so on.
A typical rural preceptory of the Templars usually comprised of farmland centred around a manor house, with any numbers of barns, stables and outhouses, depending on the size and location of the farm. No entire preceptories remain today, but many individual buildings do. These enormous barns were constructed by the Knights Templar more than 800 years ago. The aim of all Templar preceptories was to make money. A third of all income went to the knights on the frontier. Every donation, large or small, was fully exploited for maximum revenue. If they were given unused land, they had it settled and cultivated. New mills, wine presses and ovens were constructed to soak up the extra agricultural produce, and new village and town markets were created. In this way, the economy of an entire region could steadily be boosted. But it also meant that the Templars could take economic control of whole areas as they bought up businesses and land. In the Champagne town of Provins, the Knights Templar would eventually own more than 70 properties. The Templars were always improving their market position, and their dominance caused considerable resentment among both peasants and landholders. To their rivals, the Templars had one particularly unfair advantage. Their holdings were exempt from taxes or tithes.
It was normal for the population, in one form or another, to pay tithes. The Templars were granted an exemption from tithe on the land they acquired, which enabled them to grow perhaps more rapidly than they would have done before. So in that sense, they're not paying the proportion of their income into the church, which you might normally have expected them to have to do. Again, the justification here is that the money is being contributed towards the church, it's being contributed towards the Holy War. I think inevitably, however, when somebody gets a privilege, somebody else objects to the fact that they have a privilege.
Within 30 years of its foundation, the temple was managing farms and urban properties throughout France, England, and much of Europe. They had European headquarters in Paris and London. Many of the Templar properties on the Iberian Peninsula were fortified, as the Muslims retained a strong presence on the Spanish mainland. The Templar network provided security and lodgings all along the main trade routes of Europe, as well as to the Holy Land. Some of their most important offices were at the main Mediterranean ports. The temple was involved in shipping from its earliest days. It had soon extended its role from protecting pilgrims in the East to protecting pilgrims travelling to the East. The order constructed an early travel agency, providing pilgrims with not just security, but transport and accommodation. At first, the order had chartered vessels from the great seafaring cities of Italy, but once again the temple decided to improve its market position. It built its own ships and consolidated its long-distance travel business, an industry it had helped to create in the first place. One of the temple's most important income-generating regions was on the main axis linking the great Mediterranean and Northern European trading zones. The Champagne region of France, one of the temple heartlands, was a bridge between North and South Europe. It was here that enormous trade fairs developed, which ushered in the dawn of international business. The great trade fairs of Champagne saw the exchange of goods from all over Europe, which the Templars could not fail to benefit from. The economic boom also triggered a financial revolution, which saw the birth of modern banking. The Templars were well placed to enter the world of banking. They had offices all over Europe, and their continuous state of warfare had given the Templars the experience of handling large sums of money.
One of the reasons why the Templars were effective bankers was that people trusted them. And they trusted them not only because of their integrity, but also because they had the physical means to defend the money which they held. They had castles and they had armed men who could accompany any movement of actual specie if that was required. And they maintained their reputation for paying when required, and for honest dealing. And in that sense, therefore, the Templars were successful as bankers. The Templar Bank in Paris performed most of the functions that one would associate with a modern bank. It made loans, you could deposit money there. It actually had an open cash desk, which was open many days of the year, particularly when it was most needed, at times when payments were being made at the end of the harvest and so on. It kept separate accounts for people. It was involved in the transfer of currencies. It was involved in investment. So most of the functions you would associate with a modern bank can be seen at least in the Templar banks in Paris and in London, and also in a number of other places as well. They also perhaps went beyond some of the functions of a modern bank, and you could say that they were performing functions you'd associate with a modern accountancy firm, in that they would audit the accounts of the King of France, for instance.
The Templars' unparalleled financial acumen and entrepreneurial drive had brought the warrior monks untold wealth. The order had risen to the very pinnacle of society, and they didn't just work for the French crown. The Templars provided security and financial advice to most of Europe's great rulers, including the King of England and the Pope. But for many observers, there was a difference between what the Templars were supposed to be, poor knights of Christ battling with the infidel, and what they appeared to be, hugely wealthy aristocrats with royal connections. Although a third of all revenue provided by the Templar network was sent to the east, few ordinary people ever saw their Holy Land activities. All most people ever heard about the Crusades was a growing catalogue of defeat and humiliation. The Crusaders had lost the Christian holy sites, which was the primary aim of the Knights Templar. Their frequent setbacks in the Holy Land made many suspicious. How could they justify such riches when they were supposed to be poor knights battling Islam for the love of God alone? For years, medieval chroniclers had suspected that financial motives affected all Templar behavior in the Holy Land. A castle siege might be interpreted as a bid for gold and plunder, or a refusal to join an assault could be seen as saving costs. There were many such controversial incidents.
One of these is the capture of a man called Nasir al-Din, who was fleeing from a failed political coup in Egypt in 1154, was captured by the Latin Christians and was put into the custody of the Templars. The Templars then sold him back to his political enemies in Egypt for a large sum, and he was killed by the mob. The story that is told by some chroniclers is that this man, however, was interested in being converted to Christianity. And this doesn't redound very well on the Templars. It looks as if they're more interested in gaining the ransom money than in conversion.
But the Templars did not always take the money. Soon after their construction of a new castle on the Jordan frontier, they received a visitor.
The Muslim leader Salah ad-Din came and tried to purchase the castle from the Franks. He offered them a huge sum of money, 60,000 gold coins. And the Knight Templars refused to sell the castle. He augmented his offer to 100,000 gold coins. And the Knight Templars, as usual, boldly refused the offer. They didn't know that within few months, not only that they will lose the 100,000 gold coins, they'll lose the castle and their life as well.
The Templars' obsession with raising money was well founded, and their cautious policy in the East was based on a simple formula. Before the Battle of Hattin, it took the income from 30 manor farms to equip and maintain one single knight in the Holy Land. More than 200 had died at Hattin. Within a few decades, the cost would have risen fivefold.
The Templars needed to translate their economic empire into a military machine of some kind, which was very, very expensive. The numbers of knights probably amounted to 600. Each of those knights needed to have 4 horses. In addition, there were probably another 2,000, 2,500 sergeants or serving brothers, some of whom fought, and many more people who acted as part of the general support system, like squires, servants, cooks, and also a limited number of clerics. So there's a large number of men and horses and other animals that you needed to pay for. So the costs of this are immense, which is why in the 13th century the Templars have got to exploit their lands to their fullest extent. This in turn, of course, can sometimes lead to unpopularity, particularly if there's no military success to show for all this vast expenditure. But like most military machines, it seems as if money is being thrown down a bottomless pit to those people who are being forced to pay for it.
A Crusader knight's single most expensive item was his horse. The Templar force in the Holy Land would have required about 4,000 horses, most of which would have come from the Western network. The Muslims understood the economy of war as well as the Templars, and in battle targeted the Crusaders' horses.
In some of the sources, even at the contemporary sources, the Turkish and Saracen habit of attacking the horses was regarded almost as unsporting. Now, this has been picked up in the 19th century and even today as somehow the Turks and the Saracens are being devious. I have to say this is somewhat unfair because they're entering battle to win the battle. And if you can defeat your enemy by injuring his horse or his horses or frightening his horses, you don't have to kill the man. You're not there, as far as a Saracenic warrior is concerned, to achieve personal glory. You're there as a professional soldier with a rather modern attitude towards the job in hand, and that is to succeed.
Saladin's capture of Jerusalem had triggered a wave of crusading enthusiasm throughout Europe. The Holy City would once again be the target of a major Christian expedition. For the Templars, the new crusade was the first opportunity since Hattin to translate its massive economic resources into a military machine. The Order of the Temple was integral to the Third Crusade, led by the King of England, Richard the Lionheart, and Philip II of France. The remnants of the Crusader state in the Holy Land on the arrival of the Third Crusade existed around the three remaining cities, Antioch, Tripoli, and Tyre, all supported by sea from Sicily. Richard joined Philip II and the resident Crusaders already besieging the port of Acre, which they captured in July 1191. The Crusaders then began the march on Jerusalem and set off down the coast. A fleet shadowed their every move, providing supplies and reinforcements. The army was constantly harried by Saladin's forces, but the Crusaders made progress, clawing back Haifa and then Caesarea. On the road to Assur, Saladin attacked in strength. The Crusaders lined up, with the disciplined military orders in the vital stations. The Muslim attack was driven off by a powerful Crusader counterattack. Richard's victory over Saladin meant the Crusader state was once more firmly established in the Holy Land. Richard took Jaffa, but Jerusalem itself was just too vulnerable to Muslim attacks. The Templars had played an essential role in the Third Crusade, providing logistical support, but mainly as a coherent, disciplined military outfit Richard I could rely on at all times.
Whatever his many faults, Richard did commit resources and indeed risked his own life and health many times for the cause of the Crusades, and I think he discerned the Templars were equally prepared to make that commitment. The master of the temple, Gerard of Riedfort, died. There was a vacancy in the mastership, and Richard wished to extend his influence in that direction and managed to secure the election of one of his own vassals, a man called Robert of Sablé, as master. And from then on, there was quite a close link between the temple and Richard, and they became a very important part of his army after the taking of Acre and the march south towards, supposedly towards Jerusalem, but which never in fact took Jerusalem.
Richard the Lionheart had travelled to within sight of the Holy City, but, taking advice from his military advisors, including the cautious Templars, he had decided not to risk an attack on the city. 1 year later, Richard negotiated a treaty with Saladin, which allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Although the Third Crusade had failed to gain control of Jerusalem, the victories of Richard I had rejuvenated the Crusader states and given the Christians a firm foundation from which to begin expansion. The Templars immediately began an enormous building program that would continue for decades. The Templars created their new headquarters in the port of Acre, which became the new capital of the Christian Holy Land for the military orders and the Italian trading cities. Much of the Hospitallers compound exists today, but little remains of Acre's Templar quarter. this enormous tunnel, constructed beneath the city, is just one testament to the effort and resources the Knights Templar must have invested in the East. When Saladin died in 1193, the Islamic world once more crumbled into disunity. Islam's failure to unite against the Christians would buy the Crusaders much-needed breathing space. But the Christians could never entirely rely on Muslim divisions. For the Templars, recent success came with a price. The massive investment needed to man and fortify the newly recovered lands meant expanding the network, a corporation that was growing ever more unpopular.
The Templars' reputation tended to take a bit of a knock back in Europe rather than in the Middle East, because back in Europe is where they're coming to be seen as rich, almost money-grubbing. They became bankers, and nobody likes bankers. So there was a jealousy, a resentment. But this is not immediately transferred to those who are stationed out there on the frontier, manning the castle walls and so on.
One place where the Templars' unpopularity actually deteriorated into violence was on the island of Cyprus. In an awesome display of their wealth and resources, the Templars had purchased this entire country from King Richard, who had conquered the island en route to Palestine.
However, Richard realised that he couldn't govern it himself, and he couldn't hold it himself, and therefore he turned to the Templars as possible rulers of this island. And he sold the island to the Templars for a large sum of money. Unfortunately, the Templars never committed sufficient troops and resources to governing it, and after quite a short time there was a revolt, which the Templars survived, but which was enough to deter them from wanting to hold it any longer. But Cyprus is a very interesting case, because had the Templars taken it more seriously as a resource, it could have been the first semi-sovereign or sovereign state ruled by a military order. It never came out like that, but it could have been.
However hard the Knights struggled to justify the vast funds needed to reconstruct and man the defences of the Holy Land, the Templars would never fully shake off the suspicion that they cared more for the acquisition of gold and riches than they did for the land of Christ. In reality, whether the Templars believed it or not, the equation was simple. If they could not maintain the Crusader states, there was no reason for their existence. The Templars' credibility depended entirely on the survival of a Christian Holy Land.